All right, let's just jump right into this explainer because today we are exploring a truly mind-bending unified theory. We're talking about a framework that literally connects the mechanical physics of a simple rubber band directly to human emotion, cognitive aging, and believe it or not, civilizational collapse. It's called Evolutionary Organizational Viscoelasticity, which I know is a mouthful, but it's drawn from the brain kinematics model and continuity theory, and it is absolutely going to change how you view stress and memory.
So I want you to think about a mystery for a second. What on earth could possibly link the physical aging of your skin with a sudden emotional outburst, or even the totally irreversible fall of an empire? On the surface, these seem entirely unrelated, right? One's biological, one's psychological, and the other is purely historical. But what if they're actually all governed by the exact same underlying organizational law?
Section 1. The physics of stress. To solve this mystery, we first really need to look at physical matter and how it fundamentally handles stress. This is where our journey begins, right, in the realm of mechanical engineering and material science. In engineering, there's a concept called viscoelasticity. It describes how a material, think of a rubber band, a plastic polymer, or even biological tissue like your skin, stretches when you put stress on it. But here's the catch. It doesn't snap back perfectly like some ideal mathematical spring. Its recovery is delayed, and it never, ever recovers 100%. It permanently retains a tiny fraction of that deformation. Basically, the material literally keeps a physical record of the stress it just endured.
So, the absolutely crucial point here is this concept of residual strain. Just like repeated stretching and loading creates permanent wrinkles in our skin, or that persistent stiffness you feel in your joints as you get older, materials physically remember their stress. Every single time the system is pushed, its flexible range narrows just a little bit more.
Moving on to Section 2. A universal law. Now, continuity theory drops a complete bombshell by suggesting this isn't just some quirky rule for mechanical objects. Think about how this scales up from the very bottom. Every organized system, from the microscopic molecular structure of our cells up to the neural networks firing in our brains, all the way to massive complex cultures, inherits this core behavior. It's this finite capacity to absorb a disturbance, remember it, and slowly recover. Evolution doesn't just invent entirely new principles out of thin air. It takes this baseline physical viscoelasticity and brilliantly scales it up into biological adaptation, emotional regulation, and social resilience.
So the big takeaway here is that memory isn't just restricted to neurons. In this unified framework, every single organizational level possesses its own kind of historical persistence. Materials remember physical loading, immune systems remember specific pathogens, our personalities remember past trauma, and whole societies remember their institutions. Memory is really just a universal organizational property. It's the residual strain left behind in experience.
Section 3. The aging brain. Let's apply this universal law to something deeply personal, the human mind. If memory and aging are essentially just forms of accumulated organizational strain, how does that explain cognitive decline? Well, just like physical tissues lose their elasticity over time, the aging brain experiences reduced cortical flexibility and slower plasticity. Instead of just writing this off as damage, this theory beautifully reframes brain aging as the accumulation of residual organizational strain. Functions that require really rapid elastic adaptation, like forming brand new episodic memories, they deteriorate first, simply because the system has lost its reversible flexibility.
And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates the paradox of why an older adult might completely forget what happened yesterday, but they can remember their childhood vividly. The outer, highly plastic layers of the brain struggle to snap back and form new memories because of all that accumulated strain. But the deeply consolidated, much older pathways, those inner organizational networks that were laid down decades ago, they remain mechanically and organizationally super stable. They essentially become dominant because the competing, newer pathways have gotten too weak. Section 4. The relief valve.
Okay, so if we are continuously accumulating this organizational strain every single day of our lives, in our tissues, our minds, our emotions, how do we release it so we don't just break? The source material proposes something pretty profound. Expression isn't just communication, it's a literal strain release pathway. When we write, when we speak, or when we create art, we are literally transforming accumulated internal tension into an external, symbolic organization. We're actively venting the pressure from our internal viscoelastic systems. Because all of these organizational levels are so deeply connected, they continuously resonate with each other in a cascading loop.
chronic psychological stress doesn't just quietly sit in your mind, it cascades down into autonomic dysregulation, which literally turns into physical muscle tension, which then alters how you breathe, which loops right back up to modify your emotional state. It's this continuous, bidirectional resonance echoing across the nested levels of your body and mind.
So, what actually happens when that relief valve gets blocked? When the capacity for language degrades, like in cases of aphasia, dementia, or honestly even just extreme isolating stress, that internal strain cannot dissipate. The pressure just builds and builds inside the system until it exceeds those regulatory thresholds, and then it inevitably explodes. It comes out as frustration, highly impulsive behavior, or aggressive outbursts. The system is pushed to a breaking point simply because it can no longer vent its residual strain.
Section 5. The tipping point. This brings us to the massive climax of the theory. What exactly happens when systems are pushed way past their absolute limits at the ethical, societal, or civilizational level? Whether you're analyzing a snapping tendon, a person compromising their deepest morals just to survive, or an entire society enduring a massive economic crisis, the mathematics rely on the exact same 4 parameters: recovery capacity, organizational memory, a critical threshold, and recovery time. The definitions definitely change from physical to societal, but the fundamental organizational law, it stays identical.
Because of this, a sudden civilizational collapse, an irreversible life decision, or a massive ethical shift is almost never caused by a single, isolated trigger event. That's an illusion. Instead, it's the result of long-term, accumulated strain that has been silently building up over time, eventually crossing a critical threshold where the system simply cannot stretch anymore. It snaps, and it is forced to reorganize.
Think about massive historical events. Political revolutions, severe economic crashes, huge religious transformations, or sweeping cultural renaissances. They represent the exact same mechanism working at scale. They are moments of cultural viscoelasticity, where a society completely exceeds its flexibility limit under pressure and is essentially forced to permanently reorganize into a brand new stable structure. It's the societal equivalent of a material fracturing and reshaping, or a human mind adopting a radically new worldview after a period of really intense grief or shock.
Since this universal law applies to the literal cells in our bodies, the aging of our minds, and the broad historical cycles of our societies, we really have to end this explainer by looking inward. What unresolved tension is quietly accumulating in your own life? Are you actively venting your residual strain through expression, or is it just building up silently? Where is your residual strain building up today, and how is it eventually going to release? Thanks for hanging out with me for this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.